A gravel lane winds its way to a secluded holiday cottage near the village of Shull in West Cork, Ireland. It was here, in the early hours of 23 December 1996, that a 39-year-old woman lost her life in a brutal attack just outside her own front door, the very place she had come to escape the noise and demands of everyday life in Paris. Sophie Toscan-du-Plantier, a French documentary filmmaker, was the wife of a respected film producer who had worked alongside some of the world's most legendary directors. It would be 3 days before a neighbor discovered her body lying on the gravel path, in a condition so confronting that even experienced Garda officers from a region rarely touched by violent crime were left deeply shaken. The front door remained intact, with no signs of forced entry. Beneath Sophie's fingernails, investigators found no biological evidence belonging to her attacker, despite clear indications that she had fought desperately to defend herself. Nearly 3 decades later, one name continues to dominate discussions of the case: a British journalist who lived only a short distance away. He was arrested, then released. He remained under suspicion, yet was never formally charged in the country where the crime took place. Hundreds of miles away, another nation would eventually hand down a conviction, but the man at the center of the case was never present to hear the verdict delivered against him. Then he died. Even after his death, the biggest question remained unanswered. Had justice truly been served, or was the truth still waiting to be uncovered? Nearly 30 years spent searching for answers. That is the story behind one of Europe's most controversial murder cases. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next true crime story we'll bring you. Paris. In the early 1990s, born Sophie Buniol into a middle-class Catholic family, she grew up to become an intelligent, outgoing, and vibrant woman. Friends described her as someone who loved life, was cheerful and beautiful, and enjoyed meeting people. She built a career as a documentary filmmaker, a profession that demanded both creativity and a keen eye for observation. Her second marriage brought her together with Daniel Toscan-du-Plantier, an internationally renowned film producer who had worked alongside legendary directors including Federico Fellini and Ingmar Bergman. Together, they moved within the elite circles of Paris and counted former French President Jacques Chirac among their acquaintances. From her first marriage, Sophie had a son, Pierre-Louis, to whom she devoted all her love. Sophie's parents, Georges and Marguerite Buniol, lived in a high-ceilinged apartment in Paris, where nearly every surface was covered with silver-framed photographs of their daughter. The great distance never diminished Sophie's affection for West Cork, Ireland. She purchased an isolated farmhouse at Dunmanus West, perched about 60 meters above sea level and surrounded by rocky outcrops and sweeping green fields. At night, the flashing beam from Fastnet Lighthouse could be seen through the upstairs bedroom window. The village of Shull, with its picturesque harbour and main street lined with craft shops, cosy pubs, and Hegarty's butcher's shop, had long attracted well-known residents. Actor Jeremy Irons, broadcaster Jeremy Paxman, and film producer Lord Putnam all owned holiday homes there. Locals referred to the area as the Irish Riviera, where the number of blow-ins people who had moved in from elsewhere was almost equal to that of lifelong residents. Among those newcomers was an English freelance journalist named Ian Bailey from Gloucestershire. He settled in West Cork in 1991 after the breakdown of his marriage in England, hoping to begin a new chapter in life. Tall and heavily built, with thick dark hair, Bailey openly embraced Celtic mysticism and even adopted the Gaelic version of his name, Eowyn O'Bai. He described himself as a poet and musician, while earning a living through gardening jobs for local residents, including the poet John Montague, who later said Bailey was pleasant and fairly docile while working for him. Living with Bailey was his partner, Jules Thomas, an artist from Wales. The couple settled in a home roughly 8 miles from Sophie's farmhouse, a relatively short distance in a small community where almost everyone knew one another. To the local people, who were accustomed to welcoming newcomers from around the world, Sophie still left a particularly lasting impression. "You'd never forget meeting her," recalled one carpenter who had carried out several repair jobs at the Dunmanus West farmhouse. "She had that kind of effect on people. No one in that small community, not those closest to Sophie, and certainly not Bailey himself, could have imagined that, before long, their names would become forever linked in the public imagination in a way no one could ever have wished for." Security cameras at Cork Airport captured Sophie walking through the Avis car hire desk with her luggage at 2:30 p.m. on Friday, 20 December 1996. She was traveling alone. She had invited several friends and family members to join her, but none of them had been able to make the trip. The silver Ford Fiesta she hired would take her on the roughly 90-minute drive from the airport to Shull. The purpose of this visit was simple: to spend a few peaceful days developing an idea for a new film, far removed from the demands of her busy life in Paris. The trip was only meant to last a few days. Her 13-year-old son, Pierre-Louis, was spending the Christmas holidays with his father, Sophie's first husband. Sophie herself had already booked a flight back to France on Christmas Eve so she could reunite with her husband, Daniel, at their home in Paris. On the evening of Monday, 22 December, Sophie made her final phone call to Daniel shortly after 11 p.m. It would be the last time anyone in her family heard her voice. After the call, she went to bed with a collection of poems by the Irish poet W.B. Yeats. The book was later found still open at the very page where she had stopped reading a poem titled A Dream of Death. Meanwhile, not far from the Dunmanus West farmhouse, life in the Shoal community carried on as it always did in the days leading up to Christmas. Shops were preparing for the festive rush, the local pubs were busier than usual, and families were beginning to gather for the holiday season. No one in the local community reported anything unusual during those days. According to those who knew her in West Cork, Sophie followed her usual routine, visiting local shops, chatting briefly with familiar faces, and enjoying the peace and solitude she always sought whenever she returned to her secluded home. On the night of 22 December, and into the early hours of 23 December, no one outside the Dunmanus West farmhouse knew what was unfolding behind the doors of the isolated house. The lane leading up to the property, normally deserted after dark, was even quieter in the cold weather of late December, a silence that, only hours later, would be shattered by one of the most shocking crimes the region had ever known. Back in Paris, Sophie's family was preparing for what they believed would be a joyful Christmas reunion. Daniel continued with his usual work, fully expecting his wife to return home according to the plans they had made. Her parents, Georges and Marguerite Bugnol, were also looking forward to seeing their daughter during the holiday season, a reunion that, in the end, would never take place. For the scattered neighbors around Dunmanus West, Sophie's presence at the farmhouse during the Christmas period was nothing out of the ordinary. She often came for short visits between work commitments in Paris. None of them had any reason to believe that this trip would be any different from the many that had come before. For nearly 3 decades afterwards, no witness has ever come forward claiming to have seen what truly happened at the Dunmanus West farmhouse on that fateful night. Everything known about the crime has been reconstructed from the physical evidence left at the scene and the findings of the post-mortem examination, which were gradually revealed over the course of a lengthy investigation spanning many years. The front door showed no signs of forced entry, a detail that led many investigators to believe Sophie may have opened the door herself to someone she knew, or, at the very least, to someone she did not initially perceive as a threat. This became one of the key pieces shaping the direction of the investigation for years to come. Inside the kitchen, 2 chairs were found positioned close together. At first, investigators speculated that the arrangement suggested a conversation had taken place before the situation escalated. However, Sophie's mother later explained that this was simply one of her daughter's personal habits. Sophie often pulled 2 chairs together so she could sit and read with one leg resting on the other chair. What initially appeared to be an important clue ultimately proved to have little evidential value. Despite being widely reported by the media, the crime scene examination confirmed that a violent struggle had taken place before the attack ended. Numerous cuts and injuries to both of Sophie's hands, including severe damage to her fingers, showed that she had fought desperately until the very end and had never surrendered to her attacker. Yet when forensic specialists analyzed the blood and hair trapped beneath her fingernails, often one of the most valuable sources of biological evidence, in cases involving a physical struggle, the results matched only Sophie's own DNA. No genetic material belonging to another person was found. It was one of the most significant evidential gaps investigators faced from the very beginning. A torn piece of fabric from Sophie's leggings was caught on a nearby barbed wire fence, suggesting she had attempted to flee from the lane leading to the house, heading towards the open fields beyond, in search of help in the darkness. The local Garda officers, whose experience had largely been limited to dealing with minor incidents in a community with almost no history of serious violent crime, suddenly found themselves confronting a murder scene unlike anything they had previously encountered. The last homicide in the area had taken place more than 70 years earlier, the assassination of Irish revolutionary Michael Collins in 1922, only a few miles away. That lack of experience would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire investigation. Officers immediately began securing the scene and collecting DNA evidence, but the state pathologist was unable to attend and formally examine the body until the following day. Many experts have since argued that this delay significantly affected the quality of evidence recovered from an exposed outdoor crime scene. The weather in West Cork at the end of December offered investigators little assistance. Strong winds and persistent rain in the days that followed were believed to have washed away or scattered fibers and other minute traces that may once have existed at the scene, pieces of evidence that, had they remained intact, might have provided far clearer answers than investigators would possess over the next 3 decades. Back in Paris, Sophie's family still believed everything was fine, They thought their daughter and wife was simply enjoying a peaceful holiday in the place she loved, completely unaware of what had actually unfolded hundreds of miles away. Only a few hours later, that geographical distance would no longer matter. News of what had happened at the isolated farmhouse would soon reach Paris, changing the lives of an entire family forever. Shirley Foster, a neighbor who lived near the Dunmanus West farmhouse, happened to pass the lane leading to Sophie's home at around 10 a.m. On 26 December, St. Stephen's Day in Ireland, an important public holiday immediately following Christmas. What she saw on the gravel driveway prompted her to turn around immediately and seek help. The local Gardaí were notified within minutes. The Garda station in the small village of Shull, accustomed to the routine demands of a peaceful community, received the call at one of the busiest times of the festive season, when many officers were away enjoying the Christmas holidays with their families. The shortage of personnel during those crucial early hours would later become one of the most heavily criticized aspects of the initial response. News of the discovery spread remarkably quickly through the close-knit community of Shull, home to only around 700 residents where virtually everyone knew one another. In a place that had not experienced serious violence for decades, the initial reaction was one of complete disbelief, mixed with a growing sense of unease. Back in Paris, the news arrived in the cruelest way imaginable, a phone call during what should have been a joyful family holiday. Daniel Toscan du Plantier, Sophie's husband, who had been expecting her to return home as planned on Christmas Eve, received the devastating news completely unprepared. Sophie's parents, Georges and Marguerite Buniol, also learned of the tragedy during the holiday period as they waited for their daughter to return. For Marguerite, that moment marked the beginning of a journey that would continue for nearly 3 decades, a journey she could never have imagined when she first answered that phone call. Meanwhile, in Shull itself, residents gathered in small groups along the village's main street, exchanging rumors and fragments of unverified information as they tried to piece together what had happened. The local pub, usually filled with festive celebrations at that time of year, instead became a place of anxious conversation. The first Garda officers to arrive at the scene quickly realized that the scale of the investigation was far beyond what a small station like Shull would normally be expected to handle. They immediately contacted senior officers at the regional Garda headquarters, requesting additional personnel and experienced detectives to assist with the inquiry. For families with young children living around Dunmanus West and Shull, the news brought an unprecedented sense of insecurity. Many parents began rethinking everyday routines, particularly whether it was still safe to allow their children to move freely around a rural community that had always been considered exceptionally secure. After receiving the news, Daniel immediately made arrangements to travel to Ireland as quickly as possible, holding on to the faint hope that there had somehow been a terrible mistake, even though, deep down, he sensed the heartbreaking reality awaiting him. For Georges and Marguerite Buniol, deciding whether to travel to Ireland immediately or remain in France while awaiting official confirmation from the authorities became an agonizing dilemma during those chaotic first hours, a decision they would later admit never had a truly right or wrong answer. Irish media outlets also began reporting on the case within hours, although the initial information remained fragmented and had yet to be fully confirmed by Gardaí. Within a single day, the story had crossed Ireland's borders and appeared in news reports across France, where the prominence of the Toscan du Plantier family within the film industry ensured the case attracted widespread public attention. Senior detectives, urgently dispatched from Cork, arrived at the Dunmanus West farmhouse just hours after the incident was reported. Their first priority was to establish a secure perimeter around the entire crime scene, including the lane leading to the house and part of the surrounding land. The rugged terrain, with its rocky outcrops and dense undergrowth, made securing the scene particularly challenging. There were no natural boundaries to define the area, forcing officers to rely on police tape and a continuous guard presence that remained in place for several days. The forensic team began processing the scene according to standard procedures, photographing every area, marking the location of each item of evidence, and collecting any material that might contain genetic information. Even at this early stage, however, the limitations in both resources and experience within the local police force began to emerge. Investigators also launched an extensive door-to-door inquiry throughout the wider Dunmanus West area, interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual during the night of 22 December and the early hours of 23 December. In such a sparsely populated rural area, the small number of potential witnesses made gathering useful information particularly difficult. One of the most controversial decisions during the initial investigation was the delay in the arrival of the state pathologist, Dr. John Harbinson, who was unable to attend the scene to formally examine the body until the day after Sophie's remains were discovered. During that period, her body remained outdoors, exposed to the harsh winter weather of West Cork. Many legal and forensic experts reviewing the case years later strongly criticized this delay, arguing that it represented one of the most significant systemic failures of the investigation and had a direct impact on both the quality and reliability of the forensic evidence collected afterwards. While work continued at the primary crime scene, Garda units expanded their operations across the wider West Cork region, setting up temporary checkpoints on the main roads leading into and out of the shoal area in an effort to identify any vehicles that had travelled through the region during the relevant time frame. Investigators also began compiling a preliminary list of people who either lived near or had been present in the Dunmanus West area at the time of the killing. Within days, that list had grown to more than 50 individuals, including both lifelong local residents and the many blow-ins who had settled in the area in recent years. A temporary command centre was established at Shoal Garda Station, where detectives worked around the clock for days, attempting to piece together every fragment of information gathered from the crime scene, witness interviews, and the earliest clues concerning Sophie's final movements before the attack. For many of the younger officers involved, this was the first investigation of such scale and complexity they had ever encountered. Their approach, shaped largely by experience dealing with routine policing matters in a quiet rural community, quickly revealed its limitations, laying the groundwork for a series of legal controversies that would continue for decades. Meanwhile, Sophie's family was making its way to Ireland, completely unaware of the level of confusion and the significant shortcomings that were unfolding at the very scene where their daughter and wife had been found, shortcomings that, had they known about them at the time, would likely have deepened their fears about whether the truth would ever be uncovered. When Dr. John Harbinson finally completed the official post-mortem examination, the forensic report painted a detailed picture of the severity of what Sophie had endured. According to her family, it was a document they simply could not bring themselves to read from beginning to end. Sophie's face had been so badly damaged that it was difficult to identify her. The injuries were caused by a heavy object, most likely the concrete block found near the scene. Her right cheekbone was shattered, her eye socket fractured, and her lower lip torn. A distinctive impression, consistent with the sole of a Dr. Martin's boot, was also found on her neck, suggesting she may have been stomped on during the attack. The post-mortem concluded that Sophie's primary cause of death was catastrophic head injuries inflicted by a heavy object, together with numerous other injuries across her body that reflected the extreme violence of the assault. Forensic specialists also collected every biological sample that might prove valuable to the investigation, including blood, tissue, and other trace evidence recovered from her body. However, because of the delay in processing the crime scene, some samples may already have been contaminated or degraded, reducing the reliability of subsequent forensic analysis. Based on the available medical evidence, forensic experts estimated that Sophie died during the early hours of 23 December, consistent with the timing of her final phone call to her husband the previous evening. That estimated time of death became a crucial reference point for reconstructing the movements of everyone who later came under investigation. The concrete block believed to have caused most of the fatal injuries originated from the area surrounding the farmhouse itself. As a common building material in rural Ireland, it was not something that had been brought to the scene from elsewhere. This detail later strengthened the theory that the attacker may have acted impulsively, using whatever was immediately available rather than carrying a pre-selected weapon. For the Buniol family, learning these forensic details was deeply traumatic. Marguerite later admitted that neither she nor her husband could bring themselves to read the entire report and instead relied on their solicitor to summarize the key findings without describing the most distressing details. Alongside the official post-mortem findings, independent forensic experts were consulted in the years that followed as Sophie's family repeatedly requested fresh reviews of the original forensic evidence, hoping that something might have been overlooked during the initial examination, which had taken place under far from ideal circumstances. In 2008, more than a decade after Sophie's death, French authorities authorized the exhumation of her remains at the request of her family so that additional forensic testing could be carried out using advances in technology that had emerged over the previous 10 years. According to legal sources familiar with the case, however, no significant new evidence resulted from the examination. It was not until 2011 that French forensic scientists identified another potentially significant clue: an unidentified DNA profile recovered from one of the boots Sophie had been wearing when her body was discovered. Although only a tiny trace, the sample became the focus of international comparison efforts that continued for more than a decade as DNA technology grew increasingly sophisticated. At the time, investigators could not have imagined that this minute DNA sample would remain an unanswered mystery well into the third decade of the 21st century. Even after the man who had long been regarded as the investigation's principal suspect was no longer alive. Among the more than 50 individuals initially considered during the investigation, one name gradually stood out above all the others: Ian Bailey. Ironically, he He was also one of the first journalists to report on the case as a freelance reporter, before eventually becoming a suspect himself. This remarkable shift from reporting on the crime to being investigated for it stemmed from a combination of factors that detectives gradually uncovered during the first weeks of the inquiry. On the morning after the killing, Bailey was seen with several scratches on his face and hands. When questioned, he explained that the injuries had been caused while plucking a turkey and putting up a Christmas tree at home, perfectly ordinary activities during the festive season. Investigators also took note of what they considered Bailey's unusual level of interest in the investigation. He was frequently seen near the crime scene and regularly approached both fellow journalists and Garda officers to discuss developments in the case. Bailey was arrested for the first time in February 1997, about a month after the killing, for questioning. He was later released without charge because investigators lacked sufficient evidence. A second arrest followed in January 1998, with the same outcome. One of the key witnesses was Marie Farrell, the owner of a small local shop. She told investigators that she had seen Bailey near the road leading to Sophie's holiday home on the night of the killing. For years, her statement became one of the central pillars of the case against him until everything changed in 2005. In 2005, Farrell dramatically withdrew her original statement, claiming that she had been subjected to improper pressure from Garda investigators during the initial interviews. The reversal dealt a major blow to the investigation, casting serious doubt over one of its most significant witness accounts. Meanwhile, detectives continued examining other people who had appeared on the original list of potential suspects, including both local residents and other newcomers who had settled in the area. Ultimately, however, none attracted the same level of investigative focus as Bailey. No DNA evidence has ever directly linked Bailey to the crime scene. In the end, the case against him remained entirely circumstantial based on witness testimony, behavior investigators considered suspicious, and other contextual factors, rather than any physical evidence placing him at the scene of Sophie's killing. After reviewing the Garda file, which ran to more than 2,000 pages, Ireland's Director of Public Prosecutions concluded that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute Bailey. Although legally straightforward, the decision fueled years of public controversy, with some believing he had become a scapegoat because of his unconventional personality and lifestyle. For Bailey, the years that followed left lasting psychological scars. A man who had once hoped to build a reputation through poetry and music instead found himself becoming one of the most closely scrutinized figures in Ireland, a kind of notoriety completely different from anything he had envisioned. When he first moved to West Cork, meanwhile, Sophie's parents, Georges and Marguerite Bouniol, followed every development in the investigation with a mixture of hope and disappointment. Each time Bailey was arrested, it seemed possible that justice might finally be within reach, only for that hope to disappear once again when he was released, because prosecutors still lacked enough evidence to bring him before an Irish court. Unable to achieve the outcome they sought in Ireland, the Bouniol family turned their attention to a different legal path, the French justice system. Under French law, French citizens can request a criminal investigation in France even when the crime occurred overseas, provided the victim was a French national. Investigating Judge Patrick Gachin was assigned to the case. Over the following years, he carefully re-examined the entire case file, re-interviewed witnesses, and developed an independent line of inquiry separate from the investigation previously conducted by the Irish authorities. In April 2010, acting on a European arrest warrant issued by Judge Gachin, Ian Bailey, then 53 years old, was arrested in Ireland at France's request for extradition. It marked the first time in the entire case that a judicial authority had taken formal legal action against him after years of him remaining only a suspect. Bailey was granted bail shortly afterwards while awaiting a formal extradition hearing before the High Court in Dublin. His solicitor, Frank Buttimer, publicly stated that he would vigorously contest every attempt to have his client sent to France. The Irish legal strategy for refusing extradition rested on a key principle. Bailey had never been formally charged in the country where the crime had occurred, and Ireland's justice system was under no obligation to surrender one of its residents for trial in another country when its own Director of Public Prosecutions had already concluded that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. The legal battle over extradition continued for years, passing through multiple levels of the Irish court system, including the Supreme Court. On each occasion, the Irish courts rejected France's extradition requests, citing principles of national judicial sovereignty and Bailey's right to a fair trial. For the Bouniol family, every refusal by the Irish courts dealt another crushing blow to their already fragile hopes. Marguerite Bouniol later admitted that the sense of injustice became so overwhelming it even shook her lifelong Catholic faith. "There were days when I simply couldn't believe anymore," she confessed during a rare interview with the British press. Meanwhile, French authorities continued advancing their own legal proceedings independently of the extradition efforts. Judge Gashan and his investigative team kept gathering additional evidence while preparing for the possibility of holding a trial, even if Bailey never set foot on French soil, a rare but legally permissible procedure under French law. Throughout nearly a decade of ongoing legal battles, Bailey continued living in West Cork with his partner Jules Thomas. He enrolled in a law program at University College Cork, where lecturers later described him as a hard-working, focused student who performed well academically. On Sundays, the couple also sold organically grown vegetables from their garden at the local farmers' market in Shoal. Not everyone in the community, however, remained comfortable with his presence. Some local residents admitted they felt uneasy whenever they encountered Bailey, while others maintained a neutral position, pointing out that, legally, he remained an innocent man in the country where he lived. Standing 1.93 meters tall, Bailey had once been an imposing figure in any crowd. But as the years passed, that commanding presence appeared to fade. He looked hunted, exhausted, one local woman later remarked, describing the striking contrast between the confident man she had once known and the weary figure he had become. Across the English Channel, in Paris, Judge Gashan and the French prosecution team continued pursuing their ultimate objective, bringing the case before a criminal court, even if the proceedings would ultimately take place without the defendant being physically present. In 2003, it was Bailey who went to court, not as a defendant, but as the plaintiff. He filed a series of defamation lawsuits against several newspapers, alleging they had falsely labeled him the prime suspect and a violent man without sufficient evidence. It was an attempt to restore his reputation after years of living under the spotlight of public suspicion. Ironically, the very trial Bailey initiated became the forum where some of the most damaging allegations against him were aired. A number of witnesses testified that, on separate occasions, Bailey had appeared to admit involvement in what had happened to Sophie. Each time, however, Bailey insisted he had either been joking or that his words had been misunderstood. One of the most striking testimonies came from neighbors Richie and Rosie Shelley, who had spent New Year's Eve with Bailey in 1998. They told the court that Bailey suddenly broke down in tears during the evening and repeatedly said, "I did it. I did it. I went too far." When confronted with this testimony, Bailey offered an unusual explanation. He claimed he had merely been repeating words that Garda investigators had repeatedly directed at him during earlier interviews. "You did it. You did it. You went too far," and that the phrase had become psychologically embedded after the prolonged pressure of the interrogations. Although unusual, Bailey's explanation was not entirely without precedent. Criminal defense lawyers have documented similar psychological phenomena in individuals subjected to lengthy and intense police questioning, where language repeatedly used by investigators can become deeply ingrained and later resurface involuntarily during moments of emotional distress. After considering all the evidence presented, the jury in the 2003 defamation trial delivered a mixed verdict. Some newspapers were ordered to pay damages, while others were cleared of liability. Rather than resolving the controversy, the outcome further deepened public division over Bailey's credibility. For the Bouniol family, the testimony presented during the civil proceedings, even though it carried no direct legal weight in the murder investigation, reinforced their belief that Bailey was responsible. Bailey's legal team, meanwhile, maintained that the alleged confessions were nothing more than innocent remarks exaggerated by people who already held preconceived views about him. Beyond the Shelley's evidence, several other witnesses described similar occasions when Bailey appeared to reveal knowledge or make comments that seemed to go beyond what an uninvolved outsider would ordinarily know. Yet none of these statements was ever supported by physical or forensic evidence, leaving them permanently suspended in the grey area between rumor and legally reliable proof. Perhaps most notably, throughout nearly 3 decades of scrutiny, Bailey never wavered from his central position. He consistently denied any involvement in Sophie's death. Despite being arrested more than once, and facing countless questions from journalists and investigators alike, his answer remained unchanged for decades, a consistency that, depending on one's perspective, could be interpreted either as evidence of innocence or as the discipline of a man who had learned to exercise complete control over every public statement he made. That unwavering stance eventually became one of the most fiercely debated aspects of the entire case whenever it was revisited in documentaries, media reports, or public discussions, a reminder that, in the absence of conclusive scientific evidence, the line between truth and speculation can become remarkably difficult to define. In the years leading up to the trial, French prosecutors devoted considerable time to strengthening their case, drawing on the complete body of evidence gathered by both the Irish authorities and their own independent investigation conducted over more than 2 decades. The Bouniol family played a central role throughout this process. They provided not only personal records and memories of Sophie, but also remained relentless in pursuing every possible legal lead, determined that no detail, however small, would be overlooked during their long search for justice. French prosecutors also compiled every witness statement collected over the years, from Marie Farrell's original account despite her later retraction to the various pieces of circumstantial evidence concerning Bailey's behavior and statements, including material that had emerged during the 2003 defamation proceedings. Sophie's son, Pierre-Louis Baudivigneau, now an adult, became actively involved as well. He frequently spoke to the French media, publicly calling for justice for his mother and helping to keep public attention focused on the case throughout the years. Bailey, meanwhile, continued to insist that he would not attend any trial in France. He maintained that he had never recognized the jurisdiction of the French courts over an Irish-based British citizen in relation to an alleged offence committed on Irish soil. His French lawyer, Dominique Tricard, together with his Irish solicitor, Frank Buttimer, publicly confirmed that neither of them would appear at the proceedings, and that Bailey himself would not appoint anyone to represent him in court. The decision was a deliberate legal strategy, based on the argument that taking part in the trial could be interpreted as acknowledging the authority of the French judicial system over the case. The decision sparked considerable debate within legal circles. Some experts argued that by refusing to attend and declining legal representation in court, Bailey would lose his only opportunity to directly challenge the prosecution's evidence and arguments before the French court, a panel made up of professional judges together with ordinary citizens selected to participate in accordance with the distinctive structure of the French criminal justice system. At the same time, French prosecutors finalized their witness list. It included forensic specialists involved in both the original post-mortem examination and the later exhumation, Irish Garda officers who had taken part in the initial investigation, and several civilian witnesses whose evidence had become relevant over the course of the case. Although Ireland continued to refuse Bailey's extradition, the Irish authorities agreed to provide limited assistance by sharing investigative material and allowing certain witnesses and investigating officers to give evidence remotely or through established channels of international judicial cooperation. While limited in scope, that cooperation remained an important part of the French proceedings. For the Buniol family, seeing the case finally move towards a formal trial after more than 20 years brought a mixture of relief and anxiety. Marguerite Buniol, by then in her 80s, admitted that she still could not fully believe it was really happening until she saw the trial begin with her own eyes, having endured so many cycles of hope followed by disappointment over the years. As the trial date approached, international media turned their attention back to the case with renewed intensity. Major news organizations from France, Britain, and Ireland assigned reporters to cover every stage of the proceedings, preparing to report on what many regarded as one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Europe in recent years, more than 22 years after Sophie Toscan du Plantier's life was cut short. On 27 May 2019, the trial formally opened before the Cour d'Assises in Paris, more than 22 years after Sophie Toscan du Plantier lost her life. As he had announced in advance, Ian Bailey did not attend the proceedings and chose not to appoint legal representation to appear on his behalf. Sophie's parents, along with her son, Pierre-Louis, were present throughout the trial, a deeply symbolic moment after more than 2 decades of waiting. The proceedings were relatively brief, relying largely on the comprehensive case file that had been assembled over many years rather than the type of direct courtroom exchanges typically seen when a defendant is present. French prosecutors presented the case they had spent years building, outlining what they argued was a consistent pattern of circumstantial evidence. Their submissions covered Bailey's behavior in the aftermath of Sophie's death, the controversial witness testimony heard during the 2003 defamation trial, and a range of additional contextual evidence gathered from multiple independent sources. After deliberation, the court found Bailey guilty of the intentional killing of Sophie Toscan du Plantier and sentenced him, in absentia, to 25 years imprisonment. For the Buniol family, hearing the verdict brought a mixture of relief and enduring grief. After 22 years, a court had finally delivered a judgment. Yet the man named in that judgment had never been required to face its practical consequences in the country where he continued to live. Upon learning of the verdict through his legal advisors, Bailey again firmly maintained his innocence, describing the trial as entirely artificial and politically motivated. He remained in West Cork and continued his daily life, without being imprisoned or otherwise deprived of his liberty under Irish law. To many international legal observers, the outcome highlighted an unusual and complex legal situation. A man sentenced to 25 years in prison by the courts of one country while remaining free to live, travel and continue his studies in another country, where he had never been formally charged with the offence. In the years following the conviction, Ireland continued to reject further attempts by France to secure Bailey's extradition. Irish authorities maintained their long-standing legal position that Bailey had never been prosecuted by the Irish Director of Public Prosecutions, and that enforcing a foreign conviction for an offence that had never been tried in Ireland was inconsistent with fundamental principles of Irish law. In January 2024, Ian Bailey died suddenly of a heart attack at his home in West Cork at the age of 66. He died a free man, having never served a single day of the 25-year sentence imposed by the French court 5 years earlier. His death closed one of the most significant chapters in the case, while leaving behind a difficult and enduring question. Can justice truly be said to have been achieved when the only criminal conviction ever handed down was never enforced? Even after the man long regarded as the leading suspect had passed away, the Sophie Toscan du Plantier case continued to take unexpected turns. Ireland's cold case review team, using advanced forensic DNA recovery technology known as MVAC, re-examined the concrete block and stone believed to have inflicted the majority of Sophie's fatal injuries nearly 3 decades earlier. According to multiple legal sources, the renewed testing found no DNA linking Ian Bailey to either of those items. The findings prompted Robert Sheehan, the former Irish prosecutor who had originally decided there was insufficient evidence to charge Bailey, to publicly call on the French authorities to reconsider the 2019 conviction. Meanwhile, the unidentified DNA profile discovered on Sophie's boot in 2011 remains one of the case's greatest unanswered questions. Despite being compared against more than 11 million DNA profiles from over 20 countries through the Prüm Convention, which enables international law enforcement agencies to share genetic information, no match has ever been found. The remaining members of the Barniol family have firmly opposed any attempt to reopen or overturn the French conviction. They argue that the absence of new incriminating evidence does not invalidate the body of evidence that convinced the French court to convict Bailey in 2019. Investigators reviewing the cold case have also identified another witness who recalled receiving a landline telephone call at around 6 a.m. on the morning Sophie's body was discovered several hours earlier than the timeline previously understood. That account has introduced yet another layer of uncertainty surrounding the crucial hours after the attack. Nearly 30 years after Sophie Toscan du Plantier's death, her story has grown far beyond a single criminal investigation. It has become a symbol of the complexities and limitations of cross-border justice, where two different legal systems ultimately reach dramatically different conclusions about the same man and the same case. For the people of Charles, the ghost once described by poet John Montague has never truly disappeared. And for the Barniol family, the search for the complete truth, after spanning almost an entire lifetime, may still not be over. For those who have followed this case over the decades, the final question may no longer simply be who was responsible. Instead, it has become something far more profound. Can justice ever be considered complete when the only person ever convicted died without serving the sentence imposed upon him? While the legal system that declined to prosecute him continues to question the very conviction reached by another, perhaps the final answer in the Sophie Toscan du Plantier case will never come in the form of a sentence carried out or a clear confession from anyone involved. Instead, it may forever remain suspended in uncertainty, a place where belief, doubt, and scientific evidence have never fully converged. And among the green fields and rugged stone outcrops surrounding Dunmanus West, little has changed with the passing of time. The simple Celtic cross bearing Sophie's name still stands quietly where it always has, marking the place where everything began and perhaps where the complete truth is still waiting to be discovered.